joining us now is Chris Hedges. Chris is one of the leading thinkers and writers on the left. He spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in a number of war zones and other areas around Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. Has reported from more than 50 countries and a number of distinguished publications of various kinds. He is also the author of the new book, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Chris, in your book, you argue that, any student of history understands that there are revolutionary eras that arise at different civilizations at different times, 1848 in Europe and so on. Some would argue the Arab Spring. You're arguing that our society is approaching or is in the midst of a revolutionary moment. Why do you say that?
Because the vast majority of citizens have lost or are losing faith in the system to respond rationally to what's happening around us. We see Congress with an approval rating of 7 or 8%. We see all sorts of acts of legislation being passed that have no popular support, whether it's the TPP and CAFTA, which, our elected officials, the ones that are allowed to see it, are not even allowed to speak about it. The bailing out of the banks in Wall Street, 2008, constituent calls were 100-1 against it across the political spectrum. Nobody wants wholesale surveillance. Nobody wants the endless wars in the Middle East. Nobody wants the state to take away our right to habeas corpus. It's on and on and on, but it doesn't matter what we want anymore. We've undergone a corporate coup d'etat. And I think we're in this period that Antonio Gramsci called an interregnum, where we are losing or have lost faith in the ideology and the systems that govern, but we haven't articulated what's coming next. And the longer the state remains obtuse, the longer the state refuses to respond to the grievances or restore the rights of the citizens, then the more you'll fuel that movement. Usually what happens in a time of kind of seismic upheaval is it's triggered by a crisis, whether it's economic or usually it's economic. With Wall Street, back at their vast game of global speculation, even very sober business reporters like Gretchen Morgenson of the New York Times and others are talking about the very real possibility of another global meltdown.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I guess one of the questions I would ask you, Chris, is one can accept your analysis of the breakdown in the system as it exists now, but also believe in some ways it's an optimistic analysis on your part, but in some ways one could believe, for example, the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire in the 20th century would talk about internalizing the oppressor consciousness, the notion that people don't rebel because they identify with the people who are manipulating and controlling them, and or that there's an element of despair that sets in. So what has got you thinking that there is the possibility that people will act against these conditions rather than continue to simply accept them passively?
Well, because the state is paralyzed in the sense that it doesn't respond in any way to the needs of the citizenry. And I saw that in the former Yugoslavia, where you had a self-identified liberal elite, utterly ineffectual. And once Yugoslavia's economic crisis began with hyperinflation, you saw it vomit up these very frightening figures like Radovan Karadzic or Slobodan Milosevic. And I spend a lot of time in the book, including have a whole chapter on vigilante violence, acknowledging that our backlash may very well be a right-wing backlash, especially with the sacralization of the military within the culture and all of those hyper-masculine values that come with it, that love of kind of violence, that undercurrent of racism that said we should just bomb Muslims back to the Stone Age, and the rise of movements like the Christian Right, the Tea Party, that do what proto-fascist movements do, which is direct, I think, a very legitimate rage towards the vulnerable, undocumented workers, Muslims, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists, liberals, etc. And that is a very strong part of America's DNA at a time when radicals, populists, progressives are exceedingly weak after a century of being eviscerated in the name of anti-communism. So we're already creeping towards this kind of more naked authoritarianism. We see it with militarized police forces. The fact, as the Washington Post pointed out recently, that it is not, as many of us have been saying, a person who is shot dead by police every 28 hours. In fact, it's 2 a day, 1,000 a year. And people keep marching through the streets, demanding, obviously, an end to indiscriminate lethal force on the part of police, and yet the police keep shooting and shooting and shooting. So something's going to happen. What it's going to look like, where it's going to go, is anyone's guess. And you're right that a certain segment of the population, I've been in the South with the rise of this kind of neo-Confederacy movement, which reminds me very much of Yugoslavia. People in despair retreating into sort of mythical versions of their past. It may be that many, well, without question, a certain segment, but it may be that many in the country decide to identify with the oppressor. Yeah.
Well, and another area of this that I wanted to discuss with you, Chris Hedges, was there's another form of identifying with the oppressor, it seems to me, that takes place within self-described liberal circles. I, and more famously you, have taken on Sam Harris, for example, and that element of modern atheist thinking, which seems to sacralize the institutions of neoliberal government, I would say, and power, while claiming some of the other distinctions of a truly progressive ideal, like civil rights for all and so on. So I guess to what extent, I've been a little surprised, given the events of the last 10 years economically, that there hasn't, we had the Occupy movement, but broadly, I've been a little surprised at the willingness of so many on what I would call the liberal side of the spectrum to go back and sort of accept the status quo of the liberal wing of the oligarchy, for lack of a better description. You have, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the liberal wing is a neoliberal wing.
Right.
And it's not, in that sense, liberal. That I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class that spent a long time talking about this. But the short version is it gave rise to these kind of faux liberals, people like Clinton or Obama, who speak in that traditional feel-your-pain language of liberalism, but assiduously serve markets and corporate power. And that's what I mean by an ineffectual or an impotent liberal elite or self-identified liberal elite that isn't really able to respond at all. And what happens in a moment of crisis, this is what happened in Yugoslavia, with the breakdown of society, people turn on that ineffectual liberal class that also happened in Weimar. But when they turn on them, they also throw out purported liberal values. So the backlash sees a heavy undercurrent of overt racism, homophobia, anti-intellectualism that these liberals purportedly represent. And it's counterintuitive, but one of the reasons that I've always been a supporter of Nader in 2008 wrote Ralph's major policy speeches for him is that, and this was Nader's argument, that those of us who in fact come out of a populist tradition have to begin to name the Democratic Party for what it is and fight it, because if we allow them to cloak themselves in the mantle of liberalism, when it's not liberalism, it's neoliberalism, we are discrediting those traditional democratic liberal values just in the way that the mainstream churches, by refusing to name the Christian right for who they are, which is Christian heretics, allowed them to dominate the narrative. You say the word Christian in this country, and you immediately think of a Yahoo. And that, of course, is, I have to put at the feet of these liberal institutions that didn't stand up when they should have stood up. And you're very right about figures like Harris and others. They, Chomsky calls them religious fanatics. And I think that's right. I call them secular fundamentalists, in the sense that that mindset, that binary Manichaean view of the world, black and white, good and evil, can come in religious form, but it can come in secular form, but it's the same disease. So you completely dovetail the political agenda of the most retrograde elements of the right. I mean, you have Sam Harris in the End of Faith calling on us to consider dropping a nuclear weapon on the Middle East. And I think his words are something like, well, it may be a crime given what these people believe. It's our only option. This is insane. But it comes from a kind of fundamentalist mindset where we are allowed to kill and use horrific acts of violence to instill the virtues of Western civilization, whereas, of course, the Christian right, it's about instilling the virtues of a Christian nation and crushing satanic forces, like Islam. So we have seen across the spectrum this rise of neoliberalism. It's infected the big green environmental movements, academia, and those who come out of, I think, a richer and more authentic tradition, both in terms of liberals and radicals, have been shut out of the media landscape and shut out of academia.
Well, it certainly seems that way, and it's odd, and it's disorienting to hear Bill Maher argue on behalf of himself and Sam Harris, for example, that they're fighting for the liberal side of the argument with arguments for intolerance, for example. But Chris Hedges, if you can, I'd like to take a quick break and come back and ask you more about what a revolution is and what a revolutionary is. So if we can, we'll take a quick break and come right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. I'm speaking with Chris Hedges on the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and I'm speaking with Chris Hedges, who is author of the new book, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. And Chris, before we went to break, we were talking about the liberal institutions or neoliberal institutions standing against progressive change, and you're telling us we're in a revolutionary moment. What exactly is a revolution? What qualifies in your mind as a revolution?
It's when the ruling ideology and the ruling structures have lost their credibility. And you begin this process of what Gramsci calls the interregnum, this period where people no longer have faith in the old system or in the old ideas to justify the system, in this case neoliberalism, globalization, but have yet to articulate another vision. Alexander Berkman calls it the invisible revolution, where he likens it to boiling water in a kettle. So finally you hear the whistle, you see the steam, but you don't see that subterranean process by which the foundations, both physical and ideological, have been eroded. And I think that's where we are. You see it with Congress's dismal approval rating. You see it with the passage of numerous pieces of legislation, as I said earlier, that have no popular support, indeed, that most people don't want. When I sued Obama in federal court over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which permits the U.S. to overturn over 150 years of domestic law, to use the military as a domestic police force, to seize U.S. citizens and strip them of due process and hold them in military facilities, opinion polls showed that piece of legislation had a 97% disapproval rating, and yet it passed anyway. And that's just kind of writ large. And the longer the state, which is now tone deaf and completely captive to corporate power, continues down that route, the more disenchantment grows.
And we're certainly seeing, for example, in this study there in Princeton by Gillens and Page, that public opinion appears to have no influence.
Right.
So there we are. We're in this situation now. We're in the interregnum between the dream and the reality. Falls the shadow, as T.S. Eliot would say. But okay, so we're in this shadow time now. And when it changes, we've talked about a couple possibilities. One possibility, of course, it could go wrong. It could be totalitarian in nature. What would, in your mind, an affirmative revolution look like?
Well, one that's nonviolent. I think, successful revolutions are nonviolent. And Davies and Crane Brinton make this point, that no revolution succeeds until a significant percentage of the organs of internal security either defect or refuse to defend a discredited regime. We saw that in Russia when the Cossacks would not defend the Tsar. In the Petrograd bread riots, the Tsar had to abdicate on a railway siding. We saw it when the Shah fled the country in 1979, and the armed forces equipped and trained by the United States wouldn't fight anymore. Nicaragua with Somoza. I was in East Germany when Honecker sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the demonstrators in Leipzig. They refused to do it. Honecker was out within a week. Same thing in the Velvet Revolution, which I also covered. So you get to this point that Václav Havel makes in his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, where he talks about living in truth and speaking that truth. One that the foot soldiers of the elite, the civil servants, the police, and others can hear. And that becomes devastating. You even saw it in the Arab Spring when the military in Egypt, which is the fundamental problem, of course, didn't fire on the demonstrators, sided with the demonstrators. So that is I think, that makes revolution different from wars against colonialism. And our own revolution was really about challenging the colonial power of Britain and Prussian mercenaries and the largest armada then assembled off New York City, which bombed the city. And it wasn't in that sense a revolution, where these are revolutions are internal affairs. And I think that's right. And I think that capacity to live in truth, to speak a fundamental truth about power and defy it, is the only way we're going to bring the corporate state down. We're not going to bring it down by playing their game, either in terms of the paranoia that comes with internal security and surveillance or the use of force. We can't win that way.
Now, it also seems, and it's kind of embedded, I think, in the description you just gave, Chris Hedges, it seems that part of that process that you describe is a process of transformation and in the belief of what is possible. In other words, that when Honecker's guards refuse to follow his orders, a shift in the possible suddenly takes place, and that in effect is a cognitive or a moral shift on the part of people who would never normally consider themselves part of a revolutionary process. And if that's right, I guess the question that, and you feel free to tell me if you don't believe it is right, but if that is correct or something like that is correct, then the next question I would ask you is, what is a revolutionary?
I think it's actually more of an emotional shift. I think oftentimes it's not articulated, but it's the belief that you're kind of freed from the sense that you're freed from the constraints of the old system. And of course, as soon as security elements refuse to defend the old system, then those both kind of physical and ideological shackles are lifted. Revolutions are driven by these figures, amazing figures, eccentric, ornery, stubborn, uncompromising. And I talked to a lot of them in the book, from Ronnie Cuss-Reels, who founded the armed wing of the ANC with Mandela, to Jeremy Hammond, to Mumia Abu-Jamal, to Julian Assange. And they are endowed with this quality the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls sublime madness. And Niebuhr argues, I think correctly, that in moments of extremity, or what Kant would call radical evil, liberalism is just too weak, too ineffectual, too intellectual, and too little emotional a force to work. You don't want these rebels to rule. Che Guevara is a kind of good example of somebody who was never cut out to actually administer power. But they are vital. And Baldwin writes a great essay where he compares the rebel and the artist, and he said that, it's not so much that they seek a vision as that they are possessed by it. And I think that's right, because to stand up in the face of monolithic power, whether it's in East Germany or in Tsarist Russia or anywhere else, is really almost an act of willful suicide. And yet you need these figures as kind of the tinder of revolt. What would a revolution look like? It would look like Eastern Europe, where the revolutions that I covered as a reporter, where hundreds of thousands of people day after day block the centers of cities, calling for the overthrow of the system. And even the Stasi state, once the organs of security would no longer fire on the crowds, and they did, remember, back in 1953, because there was a huge uprising in East Germany in 1953 that was crushed brutally. Once they will no longer fire on the crowds, the state is finished.
So these revolutionaries that you describe, are they, in your opinion, Chris Hedges, are they produced by the historical moment, or are they always among us, lying in wait like seeds to be planted when the historical time is right?
I think it's a kind of personality type. Hannah Arendt says that, in a moments of radical evil, you don't turn to those who say this shouldn't be done or this oughtn't to be done. You turn to those who say, I can't. And I think it's kind of just the way they're built, which is why they're not particularly good in terms of exercising power, because they're not good at compromise. It's the zeitgeist of the moment that kind of, all comes together to give them a role. But we forget that most people who actually carry out acts of rebellion don't succeed. And, their names have often been blotted out throughout history. So it's a convergence of events that all come together to suddenly elevate a figure who, in a functioning and more fluid society, would never be elevated.
So is Edward Snowden another example you listed?
Yes, Snowden is more of an example of somebody who carried out a singular act of conscience. I don't think that his history is one of being a rebel the way that Assange's history, going all the way back to being a teenager, has always fought against the system. And that's why I made 2 trips to London and spent a lot of time with Julian, because I think that he exemplifies exactly that in a way that Snowden doesn't. I'm a huge admirer of Snowden and what he's done for us, obviously. But I think, for him it was a kind of a moral decision at a particular moment, whereas Assange's life has always been one of resistance.
Now, something that intrigues me, Chris Hedges, about the notion of the rebel as a singular personality type is the way in which that vast majority of human beings who are not rebels respond to that type of person. And it may be at certain times that they are publicly despised, particularly if there is a propaganda campaign against the individual in question. But it seems that symbolically there's almost something in our DNA, or so deep-seated in our collective memory, that resonates with an image when a revolutionary image, or the image of a revolutionary, is culturally permissible or permissible by the power structure. I'm thinking, for example, of the image of Tiananmen Square and the one man standing against the tank. Now, that was an image that was not suppressed in this country because it, for political reasons, I would argue, but it's something that I think had such a broad resonance. Or, there have been books written on the appropriation and dissemination of Che Guevara's face, that seminal picture Guevara with a hat with a star on it or so on. There is something about the revolutionary as an individual, as a symbol, that seems to resonate in the broader culture, even in non-revolutionary moments. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, because these aren't people who are going to sell you out, and they know it. I mean, Havel, I was in the Magic Lantern Theater every night in Prague during the Velvet Revolution with Havel and Dinsbeer and Klaus and everyone who would inherit the government. Havel was not a particularly gifted speaker. He wasn't a charismatic figure, but he had been resisting since Charter 77. Although he'd been a non-person, his plays weren't performed, his essays weren't published, he was in and out of jail. But everyone knew in 1989 that Havel had paid the price and had the moral authority and wouldn't sell them out. And so when you face power that is seeking to crush your movement, you are inevitably going to turn to those figures who you know will not waver and, in fact, will even accept death rather than compromise. And that's why they become so important in a revolutionary movement.
And there's an element of serenity, it seems, many times. You know, the popular image of the revolutionary as wild-eyed or extreme or emotional, but there seems, I sat with Havel in a restaurant at 11 o'clock at night one night while he had his glass of wine when he was running the country, and he radiated serenity and the Tiananmen image, a very centeredness about them. Is that part of it, or am I projecting here?
No, I think you're right, and I think Mandela, I didn't meet him, but I sensed that Mandela had precisely that quality as well, because they know. I mean, they've decided, and I certainly felt that serenity, when I saw Havel speak night after night in the Magic Lantern. And there's almost a fatalism, an acceptance that, whatever comes, they're doing what they think is right. Subcomandante Marcos has that, I think. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's not in my book, but I think it's a good point. I think you're right.
I guess I would end with this then, Chris Hedges. In terms of our own future, obviously no one can predict the future, but I'll just say, does your intuition tell you anything? Do you have a sense of, if we're in an interregnum now, do you have a sense of what the next few years will look like?
Well, if you look back at how previous civilizations have collapsed, Jared Diamond, did this in his book Collapse, but go look at writings like from anthropologists like Joseph Tainer, The Collapse of Complex Societies, or Redman, Impacts on Ancient Environments. We are deteriorating. The pattern that we exhibit is the pattern that past civilizations in decline have exhibited. And I don't know that there's anything within human history or human nature to show that, we're not going to collapse the way other civilizations collapsed. The problem is that when we go down this time, the whole planet goes with us. There are no new lands to conquer, no new peoples to subjugate, no new natural resources to plunder. And I have children. I mean, that is terribly frightening. And in moments of collapse, you tend to cough up very despotic, tyrannical systems. Whether it's the Dark Ages, or whether it's, the collapse of Islam or whatever it is. So I don't see anything, intellectually to say that we will chart another path. On the other point, if we don't chart another path, we're finished as a species. And we have to break the back of corporate power, which unleashed is, as Karl Marx understood, a revolutionary force. It has no internal constraints. It does what it always does, which is commodify everything. And now, without any external constraints, it will drive us forward into collapse, into exhaustion or collapse, both in terms of its commodification of human beings as well as its commodification of the natural world. And this is it. I mean, if we don't win this one, it's over. And we're already seeing the devastating effects of climate change, which with every climate change report is far more dire than the last, with the climate scientists telling us, well, we miscalculated, it's far worse, the deterioration is far more rapid. We were measuring the Arctic ice based on old layers of ice. In fact, there are no old layers of ice, on and on and on. This will be the hottest year recorded in human history. People are already talking about the sixth great extinction. The seas are dying. This is really, in kind of theological terms, a fight for life against forces of death. And I think, we have to resist, especially for the generations that come after us. And finally, we have to look at rebellion as a moral imperative in this sense, that when you fight forces like this, it's really about affirming life. And it's finally, we can't define success by what we achieve, but we have to look at rebellion more as, what it allows us to become, which is moral beings, surrounded by forces of, destruction.
Well, beautifully said, and I have little or nothing to add to that, except thank you for joining us. Chris Hedges is the author of Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.